It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting through my website, emailrevealer.com, or you can email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like our show, be sure and check out our Patreon, the Opperman Report Patreon. I put up 8 hours of new content there every month, and you can listen to all this content you hear Monday to Friday on AM/FM radio ad-free on the Opperman Report Patreon. Of course, on Spreaker is our archives. They're always free. You get an email notification anytime there's new content, and there's a chat room, too, where you can communicate with other guests. I'm very excited about our guest today. He has a website called democracyatwork.com. And also to a very popular YouTube channel called Democracy at Work. We have with us today Professor Richard D. Wolff, and we're talking about his book, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from the Pandemic or Itself. Dr. Wolff, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I just happened to be driving in the car this week in Tampa, Florida area, Tampa Bay, Florida, where I think we have more Confederate flags than we have anything else. And I heard you on the radio, and I was so excited to hear your work. Tell us about yourself. Who is Richard D. Wolff?
Well, let's see. It's an honor to be on your program. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity. I guess the best way to describe me is briefly. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, at a time when they had a thriving steel industry in that part of the country. And my father worked in one of those steel mills called the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, doing the work of building the steel that in many ways built the United States. I went on to go to school and go to college and ended up being a professor of economics, which is really what I've done most of my adult life. As the child of immigrants, which I was, it was very important for my parents that I be as successful as possible in a way to achieve the life that they could not because they had to leave the countries from which they came, the languages they spoke, and all the rest, to make a new life here in the United States. And so I was under a lot of pressure. I went to the fanciest schools this country has. I went to Harvard and Stanford and Yale. I'm like a poster boy for elite education in this country. And I decided that the economic system that I grew up in was one that I thought, and this is true from a time when I was a teenager, I thought the world could do better, basically, than what we had. And that has been a central theme of everything I've done. And so I became a professor of economics. I started at Yale. I did most of my teaching life at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And when I retired from there, I decided to see if the country was interested in a critical perspective on capitalism, the economic system we have, whether it would be interested in hearing from somebody who thought we could do better and had some ideas about how to go about that. And all I can tell you is over the last 10 years, my audience has grown in ways I never imagined possible. I do a weekly radio and television show called Economic Update. It's broadcast on about 100 radio stations across the United States, and it is carried on half a dozen television networks into about 55 million American homes. I never thought I'd have an audience like that. I'm gratified, I'm honored, I'm a little bit overwhelmed by it, but I think that's the reality and probably why you encountered me in Tampa Bay, Florida.
And you're an economist. And
yes,
many of your books are about understanding socialism, understanding Marxism, and how capitalism is hitting the fan. How would you describe your personal economic philosophy?
Well, it goes something like this. As I read the history of the human race, we are a species, as human beings, that has always looked at the world we live in with a mixture of appreciation for what it has achieved, coupled with the notion we can and we should do better. I think that's the secret behind the technological advances we have, the medical advances we have, across the board, the progress, and I take that seriously, that we've made. But unlike other folks, it never dawned on me, and it still doesn't, that this progress has come to an end. I know that folks are scared of the future because it's unknown, and that's always a little scary for everybody, me included. But I don't want to give up the notion that we as a species can do better. So I love it that here in the United States we ask questions. Can our transportation system be better? Can our educational system be better? Can our medical system work better? We do that, and we make it better because we ask that question. But in my lifetime here in the United States, there was a taboo. And the taboo held, you don't say that and you don't ask those questions about the economy. We're supposed to believe, my teachers told me that, my family told me that we are the best economy the world has ever seen. You can't do better than what we have done. In other words, progress has stopped. We don't need to think about it. We don't need to worry about it. This is the best economic system imaginable. And frankly, I don't believe it. I've never believed it. The best minds in this country have tried to persuade me to believe it. I didn't find their arguments adequate. I think there are serious problems with our capitalist system, which I would be glad to tell you about. And I think there are better ways of getting the job done to produce a rising standard of living for the American people. So I'm a critic, if you like, of capitalism. And that's my approach to all of the economic analysis I do.
Why don't you give us some examples of the problems with capitalism?
Sure. Let me focus on three of them, just to pick three that are important. Number one, capitalism is an extraordinarily unstable system. What do I mean? Well, capitalism, the modern form of it, is usually dated as having started around the 17th century in England and having spread from England to Western Europe, eventually to what we now call the United States, Japan, and eventually the whole world. The last 3 centuries have been the centuries of the global spread of capitalism, wherever the capitalist system settled in. And let me explain what I mean by capitalism. It is a way of arranging for the production and distribution of the goods and services without which modern society isn't possible. Capitalism has a very distinctive way of doing that. We organize the factories, the offices, the stores in a very interesting way. A very small number of people sit at the top running the enterprise. We call them the owner if it's a small enterprise. The partners, if it's a bit larger, or the corporation, and that is the institution that does most of the work producing goods and services in our society these days. If it's a corporation, it's the board of directors or the major shareholders. A dozen or two people is what we're talking about here. The vast majority of the people engaged in working in the factory, the office, or the store are the employees. They're the ones who are excluded from deciding what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. We all, as employees, help to produce those profits, but we are excluded from deciding what to do with them. That is the exclusive responsibility and obligation and opportunity for the tiny number of folks at the top. This is quite different from the way, for example, the previous economic system in Western Europe, which we call feudalism, organized things. They had lords and serfs. If you go back further, you have slavery. They had masters and slaves. We don't have that. We overthrew slavery, civil war in this country. We overthrew feudalism. The American and French revolutions finished that off in Europe. And so we replaced slavery and feudalism with this new arrangement of employers and employees. This system is unstable because every 4 to 7 years, on average, it crashes. It's like buying a computer that every 4 to 7 months or weeks just went on the fritz and stopped allowing you to do your email or to keep your records or anything else like that. There's an agency in the United States called the National Bureau of Economic Research, which keeps record of these crashes, and that's where the every 4 to 7 year average comes from. And this is extraordinary. Every 4 to 7 years, suddenly, millions of people are thrown out of work. Millions of people face interruptions of their education, interruptions of their ability to stay in their home. Life gets very difficult. Alcoholism goes up. Marital difficulties get intensified. People without work don't know what's going to happen next. It's really pretty rough.
But Professor Wolff, is this by design, or is this by design that this happens?
No, it's built into the system. Nobody wants it. It's one of the funniest things about it. If you think about it, the businessman and woman, they don't want their business to go belly up. They don't want millions of people to have no income so they can't buy whatever the business produces. The workers don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to lose their income and thereby be unable to make their mortgage payments and lose their home. So no, nobody wants this. But it's the way the system works. Look, in this new century that we're living in, we had the so-called dot-com crisis in 2000. We had the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008. And we have the COVID-19 crisis now. 20 years, 3 crises, right on schedule, on average, every 7 years. This is a disaster. And a system that is as unstable as this, causing this kind of mayhem so regularly everywhere in the world for 300 years, is a system about which I think I can say without risk of contradiction, we can do better than that. We should not be subject to a system that works like this when almost everybody agrees we'd be a lot better off if it weren't. You know what? As a teacher, I lean across the podium sometimes when I'm teaching my students, and I say to them the following to get this idea across. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out years ago. You wouldn't tolerate this. It is an unfair thing to put societies through this sort of thing. And by the way, capitalism has tried every which way to prevent this, to stop it, to overcome it. We even have a kind of economics called Keynesian economics that's devoted to doing this, and that was invented in the middle of the 1930s, the worst crash capitalism ever had so far, to develop the mechanisms to try to manage this. It didn't work. We haven't been able to do it. The second big flaw of capitalism is inequality. And I could give you a million examples. I'm going to give you one that's in everybody's mind right now. We've just gone through one of the hardest 14 months in the history of the United States. We had an economic crash of the kind I just was speaking about, but we had something at the same time. We had the worst public health disaster in a century, the pandemic, COVID-19. We've had pandemics before, we've had crashes before, but we never had them at the same time. That is an amazing experience. During that time, two things happened that seemed to me an unspeakable criticism of capitalism. If you look at the 650 billionaires here in the United States, people like Bill Gates or Elon Musk or any of the people whose names we now know, the 650 billionaires, if you add them all up, their wealth went up by just shy of $1 trillion over the last 14 months. During the same period of time, 82 million Americans had to file for unemployment compensation. They lost their job, in some cases just for a few weeks, in other cases for the entire 14 months. 82 million is more than half of the entire labor force of the United States. And when you're unemployed, you use up whatever savings you might have had. You become a bit of a burden on the rest of the folks in your family or your neighbors or your friends. It's really rough. What kind of a society makes the already richest 650 people unspeakably richer while the vast majority of their fellow citizens have to go through the unemployment and all that it means? No one can tell me that we can't do better than a system that is so unequal, so unfair in terms of a burden of struggling with an unstable economic system and a horrible viral disease than what we have just done. The United States has 4% of the world's population, but we account for 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. We are one of the richest countries in the world. We have one of the most developed medical systems, but our system could not put together the wealth we have with the medical skills we've accumulated to save us from what other countries with much less in the way of wealth and resources and much less in the way of a developed medical system were able to do. It's a sign that our system doesn't work. My last point would be about democracy. I think most Americans believe in, support, and welcome democracy. I certainly do. I believe that if you're affected by a decision, you have the right to participate in making it. That's why I'm happy that I can vote. It's not enough, but at least once a year I can go in there and I can have some impact on the mayor or the council member or the president or whoever is making decisions that obviously affect me. I can have some power over them. However, when I go into a capitalist enterprise, a factory, an office, a store, I leave democracy. Because in that workplace, I don't have any power on the boss. The boss can decide what to produce. I don't. I'm an employee. The boss can decide what technology to use. I don't have any power over that decision at all. The employer can decide to move production out of the United States to, I don't know, China or Brazil or India, depriving my community of the work and the jobs, depriving me of an income. I have no say over that. And each day that I work using my brains and muscles as a worker, I help to produce the profits of the enterprise in which I am employed. And yet I have no say over what is done with those profits. That tiny group at the top, the employer, gets all the profits and decides what to do. I am excluded from all of these basic business decisions, even though they affect me in 100 different ways. I don't think it's therefore democratic, and I think we can and we should have a democratically organized workplace, and capitalism isn't that. So those are the big three I would bring up, as why I find capitalism wanting and think we can do better.
Professor Richard D. Wolff, let me ask you a question. With what you just described, is that when the American worker walks into the factory or the business place, he loses his freedom. He willingly gives up his freedom for a couple of bucks.
Yep.
But the average person will think of capitalism, and they think capitalism equals freedom. How can they be so confused?
Well, I don't think it's... I would be nicer to them. I wouldn't use the word confuse. I want to be more generous.
Okay.
Here's the situation. And I even want to solicit some sympathy for what's going on from the perspective of the employer. The bottom line, once you kind of get through the BS, the bottom line is that the employers are a small minority of the population. If you add up all the people who sit on boards of directors, all the people who own the shares of American companies, and for those who are not familiar, the top 10% of Americans own 80% of all the shares of stock in this country. Highly concentrated wealth and power at the top of our economic system. But it's a small number of people. It's a small minority. But because they're in the position of power, they run the enterprises, they own them, they take the disproportionate amount of the profits and give it to themselves. That's why they're billionaires. That's why they are in the situation that they're in. And I want you to have some sympathy for them, because they see something which I think all of us see, even if we're a little scared to say so. Namely, that if you're a minority, as the employers are, and you have become very wealthy by the power you have and the wealth you've accumulated, you're going to be the object of envy, jealousy, bitterness, and criticism from the majority, who are excluded from being billionaires, for example. And you better be very careful, since you're a small minority, that you are not overwhelmed by the majority. And what do I mean here? I mean elections. Look, we live in a country that believes in universal suffrage, that every adult pretty much has the right to vote. Well, the overwhelming majority of voters in the United States are employees, not employers, which means they could put up the candidates, they could put up the proposals to change this economic system, and they have the majority. They'd win every time. And one of the things they might do is to say, we don't want the wealth to be accumulated by a tiny number of people, let alone during a pandemic. And they could pass the tax laws, and they could pass every other kind of law, and they would be the majority who could get that done. So the minority that sits at the top of capitalism long ago understood and devoted a lot of money to making sure that people see the world in a different way. And I'll use your example. They should see capitalism as if it meant freedom, as if it was freedom. They want people not to think about the alternatives, not to wonder about how you could do better. They make it very difficult for people who are critics like me to get the audience that would be responsive if they could hear what we think and what we say. But most people who have been critical of capitalism have been very quickly demonized, kept off the airways, kept away, so that the idea that capitalism is freedom, rather than, as you rightly put it, literally the opposite, is a minority perspective, although, and this is really important, it's changing now, and it's changing in a way that I think the genie is out of the bottle and will not easily be pushed back in.
Professor Wolff, I agree with you. People aren't afraid of the word socialism as they once were. And
Right.
when I look at the popularity of your work, your radio station, 150 stations, what is this, 235 subscribers on YouTube.
Right.
So there's people out there that are looking for this, right?
Yep.
But they're being sold a con job and being told that certain capitalists are actually socialists. Okay? Like Democrats are somehow now, Democrats that are capitalists, clearly capitalists, are socialists that are making no socialist proposals.
Absolutely. Look, let me put it to you this way. The United States has been, and there is no getting around this, a remarkable event in human history. From roughly 1820, a few years after we gained independence, to around 1970. For that 150 years, the United States economy was on a roller coaster that seemingly only went up. It was a wonderful ride. Tens of millions of immigrants came from all over Europe and eventually from other places too to get on that roller coaster going up. Rising standard of living, rising quality of life. It really was a heady ride. It gave Americans the sense that they lived in a charmed society, an exceptional society. If you were religious, you believed that God must love us better than he or she or whatever you happen to believe loves other people, because it was so wonderful. And it was wonderful. No other country achieved the standard of living that was achieved in this country. And so it was understandable that Americans would begin to believe that somehow it's ordained that every generation will live better than their parents, and that the parents live better than the grandparents, and that our kids will do better than we were able to do, etc., etc. Because it was true for 150 years. Other countries didn't have that. It was remarkable. But here's what I have to say to you as a professional economist. It stopped in the 1970s, and it never resumed. Up until then, every decade, the wages were higher, enabling people, wage earners, the majority, employees, to buy more stuff, to have a better life. Since the 1970s, that hasn't been true. The only way the standard of living of Americans grew after the 1970s was not because their wages went up, but because their borrowing went up. It's the 1970s when we begin, all of us, to have that plastic in our wallets that allows us to pay on credit with our credit card. That it was only in the modern period that everybody buys a car on time, that everybody now pays for a college education with borrowing. We are up to our eyeballs in debts, as everybody now understands, and it's only getting worse. We're in a society that didn't grow very much afterwards. Since the 1970s, let me give you one example. Every year for the last 25 years, the average rate of growth of economics, of the total output of goods and services in the United States, has averaged, over the last 25 years, somewhere between 2 and 3%. In the People's Republic of China, over the exact same 25 years, the average increase in total output of goods and services has increased 6 to 9%. It's not even close. We now have in the United States a society that isn't growing the way it once did, and a competitor who's outgrowing us at a scale that is terrifying for large numbers of people who haven't been paying attention. I think what you're seeing is the slow recognition by all kinds of Americans that this story that they've been told, that this is the greatest system, this is the best system, you can't do better than this, we're the king of the hill, it's just not true anymore. And it has to be faced. That's very hard for people. And so, yeah, you're going to get people who are not socialists, but suddenly cozying up to such words because they're popular, because large numbers of people realize that capitalism isn't the be-all and end-all, and are beginning to get interested in alternatives like socialism. We're still a long way from people deciding that they're socialists, but they want to ask those questions. They want to explore the alternatives. And between you and me, it's long past due that we should do that. It's not healthy to make it a taboo. It's not healthy to not question an economic system. Look, we've improved our education system, our medical system, our transportation system, in part because people were critical and said we can do better, and we argued about it, we debated it, and we made some changes that have been good ones. The same applies to economics. We got to get over that Cold War mentality that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and there's nothing to discuss. This is an unhealthy arrangement, and it's kept us from making the critical observations and the changes that we need as a society.
We're speaking with Professor Richard D. Wolff. He's the author of the book, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. You can check him out on his YouTube channel, which is called Democracy at Work, or his website, democracyatwork.info. We'll be right back after these messages with more of Professor Richard D. Wolff. And it's Wolff with two Fs, Wolff. We'll be right back after these messages. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. Don't forget you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Opperman Report. We're speaking today with the Professor Richard D. Wolff. His YouTube channel is Democracy at Work. His latest book is The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. And his website is democracyatwork.info. Incredible information. I'm enjoying this so much. Professor Wolff, people often say, that old saying, that old boring saying, people say, well, democracy is the worst system unless you look at the other systems out there, the other economic systems around the country. So what would you say to that around the world?
I agree. I think that if I understand correctly...
Oh, no, I didn't mean democracy. I meant capitalism. I'm sorry. I apologize. It's interchangeable in some...
That's right. That's how we all grew up, but I don't believe it.
Even I fell for that. How's that?
I'm a big fan of democracy. Yes. Winston Churchill made that statement that you just read. Democracy is messy, democracy is difficult, but it really looks good when you compare it to the alternatives. Right. And my critique of capitalism, as I tried to explain, is precisely based on the flaws it has, one of which is that it isn't democratic. That when you go to work, and let's remember what it means when I say you go to work. 5 out of 7 days for most Americans, they go to work. They work in those 5 out of the 7 days, the best hours of the day, 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 or whatever it is. Between getting ready for work and traveling to work and doing your work and recovering from the work and going back home, this is the single most important and largest time spent. And during that time, you're using your brains, your muscle, to be creative, to make whatever it is the enterprise is devoted to where you're working. So your job is a crucial part of your life. If you are a believer in democracy, it belongs in the workplace. It should always have been in the workplace. If it's reasonable to be democratic in the community where you live, where your home is, if you take it seriously, you're going to learn about who's competing to be the mayor or the congressperson or the senator or whatever, and you get involved and you get active and you vote and all the rest. It's because you want to have some say in how the residential community where you live is run. But it's a mystery to me. Why don't you make the same demand about where you work? It too should be democratic for all the same reasons. Democracy is a way for all of us to have input in the way all of us live and are treated. We should not have a situation where a small minority of us, the employer, can not only tell us everything we have to do with no response from us other than tell me what to do, but it's also we allow the minority of employers to deprive us of the job, and thereby to deprive us of the income from the job, and thereby to plunge our family, including our innocent spouses and children, of the sustenance without which they can't live a reasonable life. This is craziness. This is not democracy. This is what the fight for democracy was supposed to put an end to. We got rid of the kings who used to rule us, and we replaced them with democratic electoral mechanisms. But you know, the kings played a trick on us. They didn't disappear. They hid inside the enterprise, and they took on a new name. We call them the CEO instead of the king. But if you look at the power they have, it's very kingly in exactly the ways that we found unacceptable in the residential communities where we live. And it's been a mystery all my life why we accept it in the workplace community that we spend so much of our adult life in.
Well, then, Professor Wolff, explain to us, how would the American worker, under what system would they benefit better?
Okay. I'm not going to use the word socialism only because it's got a bad rap. It's been demonized for so long. It's really hard for me to imagine, and I am assuming that's true of your audience as well, talking about that in some sort of rational, reasonable way. So I'm just going to describe it in a very practical sense. Here's an alternative that already exists all over the world, including here in the United States. It goes by the name worker cooperative. And here's the way the workplace is organized. All the workers come to the workplace 9 to 5, 5 days a week, like they always did. But they don't only do the regular work of the enterprise, let's say Monday through Thursday. I'm just picking it to give an example. On Friday, they come to work as usual, but they spend all morning or maybe even the whole day or maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks in meetings. And in the meetings, they discuss what the company should be doing, what it should produce, what technologies it should use, where the production should take place, and what to do with the profits that all of their efforts helped to generate. And at the end of these discussions, they vote. One person, one vote. Everybody's equal, and the majority rules. It is a majority democratic way to decide what goes on in the enterprise. It's not a small minority, unaccountable to the majority, that makes the decision the way we have it in capitalism. It's an alternative. It allows everybody in the enterprise to have not only the particular task that they were hired to perform, but also to participate on an equal footing with everybody else in designing the enterprise, in directing the enterprise, in making all of those basic decisions that go with enterprises. This kind of alternative exists, as I say, all over the world and in the United States. We even have here in the United States the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. That is a kind of organization that links together all of the worker co-ops that have existed and exist now in the United States. And we've had them all along. They have been on the edges. They have been marginalized. People haven't been taught much about them. If you go to business school in the United States, you learn all about how capitalist enterprises operate, but you do not learn about how worker co-ops operate. I've been a professor of economics in half a dozen United States universities in my career. Never was there a course in any economics department that I ever taught in devoted to the economics of worker co-ops. It's as if that alternative didn't exist. And when people did occasionally bring it up, they were dismissed with a wave of the hand with remarks like, oh, that's socialism, or oh, that's communism, or oh, that would never work, as if there weren't literally hundreds and thousands of examples around the world where that has worked perfectly well right into our present day.
Professor, how would we transition to something like that? What would happen to the stockholder? They would have to go get a job?
Yeah, the
stockholder.
No. That's right. The stockholders would have to be explained that, look, we're changing the world. It's better for everybody, but it isn't going to be fun for you because you've been sitting at the top of the heap. You're not going to be killed. You're not going to be imprisoned. You're not going to be punished other than you're going to have to be no better, no worse than everybody else. You're going to have to be part of a worker co-op somewhere doing something useful that's a contribution. And before people get all strange about this, let me do a little reminder of American history. We fought a very bitter civil war in the United States back in the middle of the 19th century. When Abraham Lincoln, the president of the United States at that time, declared what was called the Emancipation Proclamation. He declared that all slaves, black African-American slaves, at that time, mostly in the southern part of the United States that was fighting the Civil War, they were suddenly freed. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation did. You are not a slave anymore. Nobody owns you. You are free to come and go. When that was done, you were taking away from the masters, the white masters in the South, probably their most valuable property, their slave, many of whom have paid big money to buy those slaves in a slave market. You were depriving them of their master position by taking away their property. They never got that property back. Nobody ever compensated them for that. That was the way we left slavery behind. All I'm suggesting is we did that before in this country. All but a few people do not regret our having done that, are proud that we got rid of slavery and moved on. My guess is they will be equally proud when we say, no, thank you. Capitalism, you were good to the United States for a good while. You aren't anymore. It's time to move on. And yes, those at the top will take a bit of a hit, but they will be given the same freedoms and opportunity as everybody else has, and that will be a society better for all of us.
Professor Richard D. Wolff, I know you only have a couple of minutes left because you got a hard break there, but a couple of quick questions. One, without the stockholder, how would the workers raise capital to run the company? And two, what do you want to leave us with?
Well, the workers would raise capital the same way the capitalist does. When workers work in a capitalist enterprise, they produce more value than is paid to them in wages. That difference is the profit. The workers produce more than they get. When you go to work for a capitalist and you sit down with him or her and you discuss the job you have, you end up with a conversation about the wages. And let's say you agree to work for $20 an hour. You know, even though you never took a course in economics, you know that the only reason the employer would be willing to give you $20 for every hour you work is because during the hour you work, your brains and your muscles add to what that capitalist has to sell at the end of the production process, something worth more than $20. Because if it wasn't, if your labor just added $20 worth of output for every hour that you worked, the capitalist would get that output, he would sell it, he would get the $20, he would pay you the $20 of wages, and what would be left for him? Nothing. Nada. He's not going to do that. He's only going to hire you if what you produce while you work for him is greater than what he pays you in your wage or your salary. So the profits of business are produced by the workers. The capitalist gets it. That's the way capitalism works. So the capitalist has in his hands the capital with which to grow the business or with which to invest in another business. If there were no capitalist, if we had a worker co-op, it would be the collective of workers themselves who produced more than they paid themselves in wages, and who would then take that surplus or profit, and they would decide where to invest it. There's no shortage of capital if the workers take over. It's just a different set of people get that surplus in their hands, and a different set of people make the decision where to invest it, how to invest it, what to do with the capital that their labor has produced.
Professor, but what about the startup capital? Would that come from a state bank or a public bank?
That's how many have arranged it. That's exactly how many have arranged it. If you want to make the transition now,
right,
you could have local institutions, churches, city governments provide startup capital. That already happens in our country all the time. You could have the federal government do it. You could provide low-interest loans the way we now do to small businesses. That's what the Small Business Administration in this country does. You could provide it special capital access to minority-owned businesses, to women-owned businesses. It's a traditional way of helping people who've been excluded from the capitalist economy to give them the startup capital to participate. Exactly the same could and should be done with worker co-ops. And my final comment is, if you're interested, a country that may surprise you, Italy, passed a law in 1985. It's called the Marcora Law because the Italian legislator who passed it was named Marcora. This law works as follows. If you become unemployed in Italy, you have two options. You can get an unemployment check every week for a year, sort of like we do in the United States. But you have an option B, which we do not have in the United States. If you can get at least 9 other unemployed Italian workers like yourself, you can go to the government, and the government will give you the following: your entire unemployment money in a lump sum right now, you plus at least 9 others, on one condition. You must use that lump sum as the startup money to set up a worker co-op. That's one of the reasons why Italy has more worker co-ops than anywhere else in Europe. We're not starting from scratch in making a tradition and a transition beyond capitalism. We have lots of experiments already that teach us how to do it.
We've been speaking to Professor Richard D. Wolff. The sickness is the system when capitalism fails to save us from pandemics or itself. Please go to his YouTube channel, Democracy at Work, and subscribe there. Check out his website, democracyatwork.info, and you can even make a donation. So if you like what you're hearing here and you want to support this kind of work, you got to put your money where your mouth is. Professor Wolff, thank you so much. Anytime you want to come back, I would love to have you back.
All right, Ed, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and let's do it again in the future.
It really has, but I really enjoyed this. Thank you.